Still they can't get no peace, so they call the Rasta man to get his opinion and decide to throw a party and invite everyone to the state of affairs and the tense position. Please, someone, please call the Kali man. There's a party going down on the other side of town. Everyone is invited. Let's just bring your herb and come. First came a legal sativa, Colombian gold and Sensimilia. Northern light shines at the party. From Morocco to Timbuktu. Ooh, yeah. People come together. There's a party going down. Let's make love and not war. There's a party going down. People come together. Party going down. Let's make love and not war in the world, not west and east. Though they negotiate, still they can't get no peace. So they call the Rasta man to get his opinion and decide to throw a party and invite everyone to the state of affairs and the tense position. Please, someone, please call the Kali man. Bill Weed, come join the party. Skank the Chinaman, Chinsu. French, Italians, Germans, and North and South Americans, yeah. Some from the Caribbean too. Who ain't got a split, sucking on the chalwa of hydroponic Australian sativa. So light your chalice of arbitration. Yeah. Tonight we're floating round the world. Ooh, yeah. People come together. There's a party going down. Let's make love and not war. There's a party going down. People come together. There's a party going down. Let's make love and not war. Check this out, y'all. So much war over here, war over there. Let's get together and show we care. Too much fighting over here and too much fighting over there. What happened to the love that we once did share? Too much war over here, war over there. War, 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 everywhere. People come together. Let's make love and not war. People come together. Let's make love and not war.
American Freedom Radio does an amazing job at lifting the voice of freedom, and we want to thank them for raising the voice of the marijuana movement. Michael, back to you.
Thank you, Casper. Thank you so much. And our next speaker we have lined up here is Heather Haase. Heather Haase is a consultant on drug law and policy for the International Drug Policy Consortium and the Harm Reduction Coalition. And she works mostly here in New York City in the United States. Heather, please walk us through the rough outline of the international drug policy, which is currently governed by these treaties: the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, amended in 1972, and supplanted in 1971 by the Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and then finally in 1988 with the United Nations Convention against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. So if you could just kind of run us through those, and please tell us kind of where the big chunks fit in: this World Health Organization, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the International Narcotics Control Board. Basically who does what under the Economic and Social Council of the UN.
Okay, thanks, Michael. First, I wanted just to say thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the legal side of this. We give trainings on this here, and we sort of consider this part the eating your vegetables part. But as a lawyer and a student of this stuff, I kind of enjoy it. I guess I'm kind of a nerd too. So as you mentioned, there are 3 international drug law treaties: the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the 1988 Convention against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. Try to say that really fast. 1961 Single Convention, which has 184 members, basically most of the countries in the world. A few who are not, like South Sudan, I think is one, but most countries in the world. Basically, I understand that if a country refuses to enter into these treaties, the United States just won't deal with them. Anyway, the 1961 Single Convention is the one you hear about most often. It's the bedrock. It's truly the bedrock of the international drug control system. And under that convention, the convention limits the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use, and possession of basically everything: opiates, cannabis, and cocaine to medicinal and scientific purposes. Basically, that just means, for our purposes right here, that there is no recreational use allowed under the treaties. I think Holland and Portugal were mentioned before. Those countries, I'll get into this a little bit later, but those countries don't actually disregard the treaty. They fit into a gray area under the treaties, but every country is in adherence, with exception right now of possibly the United States and coming up with Uruguay. So the other things that the Single Convention did was it established the modern scheduling system that we know of today. There was a scheduling system before, but it established the modern one, and it also, that scheduling system mirrors, or our Controlled Substances Act contains a scheduling system that mirrors that. So that's sort of how it relates to us. But the treaty itself is not self-executing, and that means that countries, it doesn't provide the law. Countries have to enact laws that implement the treaties within their own countries. So that is sort of important. The other thing that the Single Convention does, you have to remember, it has a dual purpose, and that is to ostensibly ensure availability of necessary medications for medical use. So that's also been criticized, though, whether or not that's effective. So the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances was enacted in response to drug use in the 60s, particularly, well, I think most notoriously LSD. And the reason that was made a new convention is because those drugs were not considered to be covered by the 61 Single Convention. And so the 1988 Convention against Illicit Trafficking was adopted in response to an increase in trafficking in the 80s. Although some critics of the system point out that trafficking really came about because of the 61 Convention. So it seems a little bit circular. But the 1988 Convention required members for the first time to criminalize possession for personal use. So that is a significant aspect of the 1988 Convention. Another notable thing about the 88 Convention is that it specifically states that its implementation should be accompanied by prudence and is subject to the constitutional principles and basic concepts of each country's legal system. One important thing about these treaties and the 88 Convention especially is that they allow for some flexibility. There's a gray area. They don't require a method of enforcement. They say that, that a personal use and trafficking, all these things have to be criminalized, but they don't specify how that enforcement has to take place within the country. And so that is how Holland, for example, lives kind of in that gray area. Holland actually has laws on the books that prohibit marijuana for personal use, but it follows a policy of non-enforcement of that, of its own laws, basically. And so for that reason, they are regarded as being in compliance with the treaties. And Portugal is another example with its decriminalization, that since the treaties don't provide how punishment must take place, and then Portugal has simply said it's an offense, but we choose to punish it with administrative measures.
There's been much thought given by the Beckley Foundation and the Transnational Institute, many others, on what options would be open to any nation who would have the will to engage this process to amend the treaty to allow for non-medical use of marijuana or other drugs. Please outline those various options that have been discussed. Please also reference Bolivia's action on coca in this context.
Absolutely, Michael. And I know you and I have had many conversations about this, and this is really an area that has been analyzed by scholars, and there are many thoughts about how to move forward, but all of them are complicated, basically. Let's just say that. One of the first two, I would say, they are options under the treaties strictly as a legal matter, but they aren't real options, so they're really regarded as real options. And the first one is amendment. Amendment of the treaties would require unanimous consent. Bolivia, let me explain the situation in Bolivia just briefly for people who don't know what has occurred there. In Bolivia, the coca leaf had been used for centuries for medicinal, religious, cooking, purposes, for traditional purposes. And the traditional chewing of the coca leaf in particular is completely at odds with the 61 Convention, because the convention banned the practice completely, but it allowed 25 years for it to be phased out. That 25-year period would have expired in 1989, since the treaties went into effect in 1964, and Bolivia did nothing to phase out the use of the coca leaf. In fact, it expanded it, and this can be seen the last 2 years. The Commission on Narcotic Drugs, when Evo Morales brought coca leaves and passed them out, and also introduced his line of coca products like coca liqueur, coca candy, coca tea, of course. But the tradition of coca leaf products and chewing and tea has become mainstream in Bolivia. They have hardly phased it out. So what happened was they tried to amend the treaty. They applied for an amendment, but the United States could have blocked it with just its own vote, because the decision has to be unanimous. But the United States led a group of nations called the Friends of the Conventions, who all objected to the amendment based on their reasoning was not the coca leaf in particular, but that allowing the coca leaf would threaten the integrity of the conventions. So that amendment was not successful. So I'm just going to continue to go through these options and explain what Bolivia eventually did. And so amendment is very, very, would be very difficult to happen, especially with cannabis now, given that it has to be unanimous. Another option or non-option would be rescheduling or modification. Now, this is where the WHO fits in, because the WHO would basically have to make a recommendation to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs to reschedule a substance. This was done this past Commission on Narcotic Drugs session with GHB. It was rescheduled from Schedule 4 to Schedule 2. So it can be done, but it also needs a majority vote of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which with the political setup right now, with the number of countries that would be against that, would be very difficult to achieve. So, but there are some other actions that can be taken by individual states and have been taken. One of them is withdrawal or denunciation. And this is what Bolivia ended up doing. So they withdrew from the convention. This is provided for within the convention. So it's completely legal. they just had to, apply, or they just had to give notice basically that they were withdrawing. And then following that, they gave notice that they were re-exceeding with a reservation. So that's an option under the treaties, to withdraw and exceed with the reservation. And to exceed with the reservation, to the Article 49 is the article that prohibits the use of the coca leaf. That went into effect in January because they would have needed a third of all of the member states to object to that. And although the United States tried to rally enough countries to object, they were unsuccessful in that. There were just too many countries that they would have had to get to do it. So Bolivia was successful in that, and I think that set the stage internationally for, possibly other countries doing the same. But a couple of other options that have been put out by Beckley Foundation are if there's a fundamental change in circumstances. This is Article 48 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. That if there's a fundamental change in circumstances, that could be grounds for suspension of treaty obligations. So that's pretty interesting. And there's also, just disregarding the treaty. I think, I don't know what Uruguay's position is going to be, but it seems that they're moving forward with disregarding with their proposal to regulate marijuana. And the states in the United States, it's pretty controversial right now whether this puts the United States in breach, but it looks like Colorado and Washington are just disregarding the treaty. So that's an option. I mean, there aren't really any, there isn't really anything that the International Narcotics Control Board can do really in the end. So.
Well, I thank you so much for coming on, Heather Haase, and joining with us on this very special radio seminar and conference series. This has been a very learning experience for us all. And again, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Next up, we have, hopefully, if all is working well, Gloria Lai from coming over from Thailand. Gloria Lai is a senior policy officer working in Thailand for the International Drug Policy Consortium. And I thank you so much for coming on. I understand that one of your jobs with the International Drug Policy Consortium is to engage the various UN agencies Heather spoke of on behalf of the many non-governmental organizations or NGOs of the consortium. Please help us better understand those lettered agencies, the CND, INCB, WHO, UNODC, and how do the NGOs and anyone participate and communicate with these entities?
I guess first of all, these various bodies and their roles, their mandate, how they should function is set out in the three conventions that Heather just spoke about. And so those key bodies, the CND is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it's the key global peak forum for policymaking on drugs. So you have sitting in that Commission on Narcotic Drugs about 50 member states that are represented theoretically evenly across the world. And they meet once a year in Vienna, and they come to agreement on resolutions as well as a number of other decisions on particular drug issues that have been raised by member states. You then have the INCB, that's the International Narcotics Control Board, and they have they're known as the independent quasi-judicial body that has the key mandate for monitoring member states' compliance with the drug control conventions. The WHO also has a key role in the system, and one of those main roles is to recommend the scheduling of substances. So the scheduling, how a substance is scheduled under, say, 1, 2, or 3 schedule of each convention depends on would determine how strict controls would be applied to those substances. So the WHO is a key expert scientific body for providing recommendations on how substances should be scheduled and therefore governed by governments. You then have the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and they're a key programmatic implementation body. So they have offices in many countries around the world, key regional offices as well, and they implement a number of programs and training that cross the spectrum of drug issues, from drug control to HIV prevention, drug demand reduction. So those are the key bodies in the drug control system. In terms of how non-government organizations could engage with them, there's a number of ways. And I guess one of them is firstly to have some sort of formal role on a government delegation. There are a number of governments that do have friendly relationships with non-government or civil society organizations, and sometimes invite them to join their delegation to the annual meeting of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And in that capacity, they could then liaise, but I guess their authority to influence policy decisions within the government delegation and even to influence national drug policy back home is, of course, another issue. NGOs, importantly, if they have the right status recognized by the United Nations, they can attend some key meetings of these entities that I mentioned before. So the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is the key example. And if you have what is known as ECOSOC status, an NGO can attend, participate, and even make statements in some of the formal sessions of a forum such as the CND. And that also gives you important access to member state delegations. If you wanted to raise particular issues, have a discussion with a government delegation, that's a key opportunity to do so if you're actually in the room with them. Can I just give an example of some of the work that we do and our member organizations and even non-member NGOs? This year, I think there were almost 100 NGOs that came to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. A lot of them organized seminars during lunchtimes or other hours for officials and for government officials, and also people who work for these international organizations to attend. NGOs go there to also showcase their work, to try to promote them and try to gather more support for them. But it's also, I think, really important to note that I think increasingly so that member states, that government officials will actually welcome these inputs from NGOs, and they want it. And there's almost as if they're starved of information, evidence-based recommendations on what makes good drug policy. And I think NGOs have a really important role to play there in telling them what's happening around the world. So all the stuff that has been shared by people on the program so far, from like John and Heather and Jeffrey, about and Sanho, about what has worked and what hasn't worked. I think some country governments are really keen to find out about that because they don't otherwise have the opportunity to do so. So I'll just stop there because I think I overstepped my time.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that, actually. As an activist working over in Thailand, I was hoping that you could help us understand some of the issues that are drug issues, but maybe not so obvious from this part of the world, that were local, and how those issues are maybe helped or harmed by the international drug policy up till now.
Yeah. Our office here is based in Bangkok in Thailand, but we also do work in many other countries in the region. I've often felt that this region, and in terms of when you even look at the level of drug policy debates, doesn't compare with what's happening in Latin America at all. So all that's been discussed so far on your program it's amazing to hear, and it's actually a very lively debate that's engaged in by so many different sectors of society. It's not at all the case in Asia. These tough war on drugs type policies are still very entrenched in virtually in, I would say, every country in the region. And some of the key examples is we still have in many countries compulsory detention as a form of treatment for drug use. This belief that if you isolate someone from society and you lock them up and for a year or two, that would help them get over their drug use, and that would make them stop when they release back into society. The fact that there are incredibly tough penalties for ranging from drug use, possession of even quite small quantities of drugs, tough penalties such as the death penalty. You have the death penalty here in every country in the region except for Philippines that has a moratorium on it. We have opium eradication programs that are carried out in Myanmar as well. You get widespread complaints about abuse from police officers and law enforcement officers. Those are things that I don't know if I think characterizes a lot of the drug policies here, and it's being incredibly negative. But it's also worthwhile noting that there has been change in the past few years. There's been this while there's been these tough penalties, this tough approach towards drugs, you still have at the same time some governments becoming more open to offering more evidence-based services to people who use drugs, and particularly in the area of HIV prevention. And in terms of how it's made worse by international drug policy, I think that at the root of all these horrible approaches to drug policies is the idea that drug use is evil and that drugs are evil. And this awful misconception that certain drugs like alcohol and tobacco are not really drugs, but that drugs that have been scheduled on an international convention are awful, evil drugs, the use of which can never be tolerated under any circumstances. I think that comes from the international drug control conventions that we have. And it could be helped if bodies such as the INCB, the UNODC, and influential member states such as the United States were willing to be more open and willing to accept more scientific bases for making drug policies, then that could help make a big change.
Well, I thank you so much for coming on, Gloria Lai. I have one more follow-up question that Casper has, and then after this, Jeffery will go ahead and pick up the questioning of Hannah Hetzer. But go ahead, Casper, with your follow-up question.
Yes, Gloria. A lot of countries around the world, oddly enough, do impose a death penalty for possession of marijuana, possession of other drugs, but specific, the marijuana plant. Now, I can understand a country imposing a death penalty on someone who's committed murder or an horrific crime against nature or another human being that was violent and just god-awful. But how can countries justify a policy that puts forward the death penalty if someone is just engaging in activities that are related with a plant?
Well, my view is that it does come down to this ideology about drugs that's completely not based on science, and it's been driven right from, as I said before, right from the top on these international drug conventions. And I guess there's an ideology part, and then there's also the political part as well, in that it serves a political benefit for certain actors to say that they're being tough on drugs and to not open debate on whether we should change our approach on certain substances. I
think that we are running out of time. There is so much we could say about the topic. It's really totally absurd that we have this penalty for drug use or drug trafficking. Anyway, our next guest here is Anna Hetzer. And Anna Hetzer is a policy manager of the America as a Drug Policy Alliance based in Montevideo, Uruguay. And for those of you who follow the news, you know that big news are coming from Uruguay. So this is going to be very exciting here. Hannah, just to refresh for our readers, there will be in 2016 a special drug policy summit at the UN at the request of Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, and Belize, and with the support of a lot of other Latin American countries. So there is some big debate coming up in 2016. So Anna, you are a highly qualified staff person working for Drug Policy Alliance in Latin America. You have had a first-hand experience with drug policy reform that are happening in Uruguay and elsewhere in Latin America. And that seems to be part of the conversation at the international level that will happen in New York, at the United Nations in 2016. Please give us an insight about the various reforms that are underfoot and what they might mean to an international audience in 2016. Please also review for us the recently completed successful action of Bolivia with respect to coca and what that outcome may mean to this upcoming discussion. You might want to brush on Uruguay as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. And I just want to say, so what we've seen in the past few years is a growing momentum towards acknowledging the failures of the war on drugs and calling for alternatives to the current approach, which has held extremely high costs in human lives, public health, and public safety, which you touched on, Jeffrey. And these calls for a shift away from prohibitionist policies began tentatively at first and are now growing bolder and bolder. So in 2011, we saw the creation of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, where prominent figures such as Kofi Annan, Paul Volcker, and Richard Branson joined former presidents Fernando Enrique Cardoso of Brazil, Cesar Gaviria of Colombia, and Zedillo of Mexico in saying that the time had come to break the taboo on exploring alternatives to the failed war on drugs and to encourage experimentation by governments with models of legal regulation of drugs, especially marijuana. And since early 2012, the debate has shifted from former presidents to sitting heads of states, where we're seeing Presidents Otto Pérez Molina of Guatemala, Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, and José Mujica of Uruguay, all vocally criticizing the U.S.-led war on drugs. And in May this year, the Organization of American States produced a report which was commissioned by heads of state of the hemisphere that predicted a likely hemispheric move towards marijuana legalization in the coming years. And now Uruguay will take this broad regional discussion on alternatives to drug prohibition one step further with its marijuana regulation bill that was approved just 2 weeks ago in the House of Representatives. The Uruguayan initiative represents a concrete advance, which is in line with this growing global anti-drug war rhetoric. And so since that's been passed, also we're seeing increasing movement in Mexico and in Ecuador towards the idea of marijuana regulation. So all of this is to say that the genie has really been let out of the bottle, and I think that this will have significant impacts for the UN debate in 2016. The UN drug control treaties are increasingly losing support and their ability to deter reform. I mean, as Heather mentioned, in January 2012, Bolivia withdrew from the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in disagreement with the prohibition of the chewing of coca leaf, which is an ancestral tradition in Bolivia among Bolivia's indigenous peoples, and it was readmitted to the UN's Anti-Narcotic Convention with its recognition of the right after an unsuccessful attempt to block it by the US and only 14 other countries. So this was a huge victory against the UN's often senseless drug policies and demonstrates that there's a will and a capacity to reform the drug control treaties, which were created decades ago and are outdated. So the Bolivia coca leaf precedent, along with the growing calls for a shift away from prohibitionist policies in the region, and now Uruguay's marijuana regulation bill, will likely set the UN General Assembly special session on drugs in 2016 as another stage where reform is extensively discussed. And Uruguay has actually already received a letter from the International Narcotics Control Board condemning the approval of its marijuana bill. But it's unlikely that Uruguay will face sanctions from the UN because for it to do so, it requires the will of other countries to place sanctions on Uruguay. But because the political climate is such that few countries in this region maintain a belief in current approaches, this is unlikely. And Uruguay, it will have to defend, and it will defend its rationale behind its decision to legally regulate marijuana at the UN. And from what I've heard from some of the lawyers who are working on this, is that Uruguay will acknowledge that, yes, it is signatory to the drug control treaties, but it is also signatory to many other UN treaties, such as conventions on health, human rights, and development, and that these principles are being harmed by drug prohibition. And that so at the end of the day, Uruguay's commitment to health, development, and human rights trump its commitment to drug control treaties in cases where the latter violates the former. So I think we're at a tipping point where the UN will have to revise and reform its outdated drug policies if it wants to keep up to speed with the reformative and enlightened changes that are taking place. And I think that 2016 will be an important milestone and will witness some movement.
All right, thank you, Anna. This was a very nice explanation here. Anna, can you please tell us, can you please help us to understand the different perspective of the public in Uruguay versus the public in the US with respect to drug policy? How do they view the need for reform? Do they assess blame for violence on policy, or is violence blame on the drugs, as is often the case in the US? How much does legalization in the US allow more freedom for Latin America to speak out in favor of reform?
It's interesting because in Uruguay and in Latin America in general, we're seeing the reverse of the trend that we're seeing in the U.S., where in the U.S. the public is way ahead of the politicians on this issue, where now more Americans support marijuana legalization than oppose it, and the politicians are being slow to react to this public shift. Whereas in Latin America, the public remains much more against reform and especially legalization, and it is politicians, academics, and people from the business community who are the ones calling for change. And this could be due to a number of factors. It may be due to a misconception of what legalization actually entails, where people confuse legally regulating marijuana, for example, with the legalizing of narcos, which have wrought havoc on their countries. And in Uruguay, the debate on drug policy reform has not been around as long as it has been in the United States. There's also a clear generational divide in Uruguay where young people are more open to reform and older generations are adamantly against it. And this may be related to lack of knowledge and contact with marijuana. I mean, in the U.S., there was a whole sort of flower power movement where many people either used or knew of people who used marijuana. And when you know someone who has used marijuana personally, it often becomes more difficult to vilify the drug or the user. And many of the older generations in Uruguay, and I'm talking post 40 or 50, which make up a significant part of the Uruguayan population as it's an aging country, are so removed from marijuana that the stereotypes and fear tactics are more easily adopted. However, among
by the way, Anna, can I just interject here? Could it be also that drug possession is legal in most of Latin America?
Yeah, that's actually what I was just going to get to.
Okay.
So among younger Uruguayans, marijuana use is fairly widespread because in Uruguay, the personal consumption of all drugs is legal, but all forms of access to it are penalized. So many see, this marijuana regulation proposal as an adjustment to fix a contradiction in Uruguayan law where use is legal but access is illegal. So in some of the other Latin American countries where it hasn't been, I mean, there are quite a few where it's at least certain decriminalization proposals have been accepted or put forward. But Uruguay is one of the most far-reaching of the Latin American countries in progressive measures with drug policy. And so many sort of see this marijuana regulation proposal as an adjustment to fix a contradiction in Uruguayan law where use is legal but access is illegal, which does nothing but feed a growing black market and put money into the pockets of organized crime. So Uruguay actually doesn't face many of the problems associated with marijuana and other drugs. It doesn't have a mass incarceration problem like we do in the U.S. It doesn't have major substance abuse problems, and drug trafficking hasn't had the violent effects it has had on other Latin American countries. But an interesting point is that though Uruguay is one of the safest countries in Latin America, it also has one of the highest rates of perception of risk among its population. So in other words, many Uruguayans perceive their country to be much more dangerous than it actually is. And a study came out showing that Uruguayans believe Montevideo, the capital, to be more dangerous than Colombians living in Medellin believe their city to be. So this perception about rising insecurity related to drug trafficking is why the Uruguayan government has proposed legally regulating marijuana to bring a market that already exists but is currently in the hands of organized crime under government regulation and control, and to separate the marijuana market from that of other more dangerous drugs. So to answer your question about whether legalization in the U.S. allows more freedom for Latin America to speak out in favor of reform, I would say absolutely and substantially. The debate and the changes we are seeing taking place wouldn't have been possible 5-10 years ago. And the Obama administration has shown more openness to regional debate on alternatives than other previous U.S. administrations. So at the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena in April 2012, where the presidents of the hemisphere gathered, Obama said, though I don't agree with legalization, I think it's a legitimate subject to debate, and it's time to see whether the policies we have in place are doing more harm than good. And this is a major shift in rhetoric, and I think helps allow the debate to flourish. And many Latin American countries no longer feel as much under the U.S.'s thumb on this issue, particularly because the problems have become so aggravated, and partially because of the U.S.'s new openness. But so really the key factor has been the legalization of recreational marijuana in Washington and Colorado last November, and that put the U.S. in a position where if it tries to respond and to repress international reform, it's just going to be labeled hypocritical. And this is the same with the UN, where the U.S. can't push the UN to enforce its drug control treaties against Uruguay, because then it would have to face sanctions itself for the states within its territory that are possibly breaking with UN conventions. So I think that's been essential for the movement in Latin America. So the fear of U.S. reactions has diminished, as they can now put to the U.S. and say, well, look what's happening at home. You can't fight a war abroad that you're not following domestically. And finally, so this week was a really exciting one in the U.S. where, with Eric Holder's remarks, it looks like changes in the U.S. are coming not just on a state level, but federally too, which I think will also impact Latin America. So to conclude, I think we're on a wave where we're seeing growing support for reform both in Latin America and in the U.S., and I'm excited to see what the coming years have in store for us.
Well, thank you so much. This is very informative, and it must be very exciting for you. You are right in the eye of the storm in many ways. Anna, are you familiar with the debate going on now in Argentina and also to a lesser extent in Brazil? And you might want to talk about the debate going on in Colombia and Guatemala.
Sure. So the places we're seeing the biggest movement, sort of reform movement in Latin America after Uruguay is, well, now in the past weeks is Mexico City and Mexico, where a congressman, Fernando Belanzauran, introduced a marijuana marijuana regulation bill, which was largely modeled after the Colorado bill. And though it's unlikely to pass, there might be some possibility of Mexico City passing a bill. I mean, Mexico City has always been at the forefront of more progressive policies. They have abortion and marriage equality, whereas the rest of the country doesn't. So they might be able to move forward with that. And it's really kicked up a debate in Mexico because they are facing some of the worst effects of drug prohibition. Ecuador is also reviewing, sort of silently reviewing a marijuana legalization and regulation proposal. President Correa of Ecuador he's come out in sort of supporting Perez Molina when he came out in support of changing policies, but he also he has a sort of a difficult role where he finds it difficult on the home front to speak about drug policy reform because his father was imprisoned for low-level drug trafficking. But we might see something out of Ecuador. Brazil actually has taken a step back. It was in last decade, it was going towards a more reform centered policy, and really now with some of the pacification and other policies aimed at quote unquote, sort of in parentheses, cleaning up the city, we've really seen a crackdown and stigmatization of drug use and users. And last 2 weeks ago when the Pope made his comments in Brazil, they really had a lot of residents there, and it's a religious country, so I think Brazil will take a little bit more time to reach some level of reform. Dilma hasn't shown any knack for that. Actually, in Colombia, Bogota is doing something very interesting where the mayor has proposed where the national government is right wing, but the Bogota mayor's office is left wing. He actually is proposing things like controlled consumption rooms and needle exchange, so a lot of more harm reduction principles, which would be exciting if they passed. So basically, we're seeing this shift in Latin America. We're also in Argentina and Chile. There are bills to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, and we'll just have to see in the coming months or years if what Uruguay has just done will pick up traction, will make other countries pick up some traction on this issue. But I think there's really, in most countries in Latin America, there's some sort of initiative coming from some political sector to do some kind of reform.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anna. This is fascinating. I think we are living very interesting time here in drug policy. Dreams, people that have dreamt for quite a long time, and this is happening now. I would like to introduce Alan Clear, who has been the executive director of the Harm Reduction Coalition since 1995. So, and harm reduction is such an important concept nowadays in drug policy reform. For the record, we moved from the dominant concept being a supply reduction, and then they tried from supply reduction, they tried to do demand reduction. Both of them failed, and the solution might be harm reduction. Alan, in 1998, the topic of discussion at the UN was demand reduction, as the concept of supply reduction was accepted years earlier. However, in 2008, the topic of discussion was harm reduction. Please describe that discussion and since 2008, and which nation have been in the coalition to add the concept of harm reduction into treaty enforcement?
Yeah, it was back in 2008. It was 10 years after the 1998. Is that right? Drugs UNGAS, and that was the UNGAS where they were going to make sure we had no drugs or drug problems within 10 years. It was they were going to eradicate drug use. And of course it didn't happen. And back in 2008, they developed a political declaration, which was a declaration that the UN was going to sign on to, which was the strategy for addressing drug use. And countries began to say, well, we need to add harm reduction into this political declaration. And add it as a concept. And as you mentioned at the beginning, that demand reduction was the battle before that. We had supply reduction, then we had demand reduction, and now we were trying to add harm reduction. And as someone who's worked in harm reduction since the early 90s, it was an extraordinary battle, extraordinary thing to witness nations actually going to bat for the term harm reduction. And at that point, it was mostly Europeans that led the charge. I think we probably had it mentioned maybe earlier today that, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs meetings, the direction of drug policy is really shaped by the US and Russia, maybe a little bit by Japan. But one of the blocks in there is the European Union. And the European Union, led by the UK, in this particular instance, as well as the Dutch and the Germans, tried to get harm reduction in. And it became a very, very intense battle behind the scenes, led by the end of the Bush administration, who were very, very determined not to get harm reduction in there. And that's what happened in the end. It was the political declaration appeared 5 years ago without the words harm reduction in it. However, this is a process that is a consensus-based process. And if you look at that political declaration, 26 countries made a statement saying that they, as far as they are concerned, that the words and other related services in the political declaration, they understand as harm reduction. So it really was a broken consensus, really, a fractured consensus. And since then, the we haven't had the opportunity to reintroduce the debate, and I'm not sure there's much stomach for the debate right now. But within the process of putting together resolutions, non-binding resolutions from the UN, different aspects of harm reduction have begun to appear. So resolutions that deal with HIV and resolutions that deal with drug overdose have been introduced, and they are essentially it's another way of introducing harm reduction strategies into the UN vocabulary.
Thank you, Alan. That was very informative. So your harm reduction work has contributed to resolution being successfully adopted by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Please take us through the experience and tell us what it means, both as an example of great activism, but in terms of harm reduction's acceptance as a doctrine.
Yeah, this is what we're talking about here was the passage of the overdose resolution last year, because as the United States actually leads the world in terms of developing interventions that address opioid overdose. So we as activists and grassroots activists began to put tools into the hands of drug users and education into the hands of drug users to combat drug overdose. We mostly did this through syringe exchange programs. So what we were mostly talking about was heroin overdose, because you hear a lot of discussion now about how prescription drug overdose is skyrocketing in this country. But if you compared that to those areas of the country where we've been doing overdose prevention amongst heroin users, you see the heroin overdose go down, which it's an interesting way of looking at it, and that we've actually been effective. And the rest of the world has begun to follow our example of providing naloxone, which is a heroin antidote or an opioid antidote to drug users, through grassroots action, through programs, through education. We prescribe naloxone to drug users. And so we thought this would be a great thing for the UN to look at. So we started networking. We talked to different diplomats who are involved with the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We actually had some conversations with the US delegation, the work CND. We certainly helped with the language, develop the language of the resolution. But one of the big things we did was, champions for this, who ended up being the Czech Republic, really. It was actually sponsored by, it was the first time that Israel would ever introduce a resolution, which is this one. And I think it was the European Union, but Denmark for some reason introduced it. But it was the Czech Republic that did all the behind the scenes work. And we were there to answer all of the questions.
Alan, I think this is fascinating, but it looks like we are running out of time. I would have a quick question about what is happening in 2016 at the United Nations, and how does marijuana legalization affect your work on harm reduction? Does it make it easier or harder?
And you have 2 minutes to answer that.
All right. The important piece of that is the 2016 drugs UNGAS. The UN discussion on drugs is going to come to New York in 2016, and we need to mobilize around that and organize around that so we're prepared. And that's what we're beginning to work on here. Many of the diplomats who work on this issue are in Vienna, so we're working to educate the diplomats here. In terms of the marijuana and harm reduction, the populations we generally work with, it would help in terms, everyone smokes weed. So that would be something that's off the table. But overall, I don't know that the legalization of marijuana actually impacts our work in general. Our work as people working harm reduction continues whether drugs are legal or legal. But we would love to see drug policy change so that the damage done by drug laws is completely eliminated and minimized.
All right. Thank you so much, Alan.
You're welcome.
Hello. Yeah, yes, this is really quite exciting, and you are totally right. We need to mobilize in massively for 2016. We have another 3 years, and we need to be ready. And I want to thank everybody here for being part of this effort here. This is what we need. And again, thanks a lot, Casper.
It has been quite an honor to be on this program today with such an illustrious group of people. I want to thank Michael Krawitz for the amazing job of organizing this particular conference, and let people know that this conference, as well as the entire global summit, will be found on will be found at time4hemp.com. And you can go there and find it in the left-hand columns. There'll be links to all of the shows. Next Friday, we will be picking up this conference with many members of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition team, discussing the horrific aspects of incarceration and the global costs to our wallets and to our future. Please make it a point to share this programming with your friends and family, and remember that these programs were also designed to be sent in MP3 format to every member of the legislative body in every country. So I feel that we have done our job here on Time for Hemp and putting together this material. You, as a member of our audience, now need to pick up the ball and carry it forward and take it out into the world and let everybody know how important it really is to take Time for Hemp.